In a world where power can shield corruption and silence the innocent, one moment of courage can ignite a revolution for justice. When soldiers cross paths with a man brutalized by those meant to protect, the line between right and wrong shatters, exposing a truth too powerful to ignore. What unfolds is a battle not just for one man's freedom, but for the soul of justice itself. Welcome, where stories come alive and justice finds its voice. Subscribe to our channel and join our growing community. Now sit back, grab a cup of coffee and relax as I tell you this intriguing and powerful tale. Captain Elias Kane squinted through the windshield as their convoy approached a lone figure at the roadside. Something wasn't right. A man, elderly and frail, was slumped on the ground with his hands tied behind his back. A patrol car sat parked nearby, its lights flashing ominously, blocking the path ahead. 3 police officers stood beside the vehicle, their posture rigid, their expressions cold. Elias signaled his driver to stop. The hum of the engine faded as Private Samara Davis, seated in the back, leaned forward to get a better look. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Elias opened the door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Let's find out." As he approached, the lead officer, a stocky man with a hardened face, raised a hand to stop him. "Move along, soldier. This doesn't concern you." Elias glanced at the elderly man. He was trembling, his head bowed low, with a streak of dried blood visible on the side of his face. The sight sent a wave of anger through Elias, though he kept his voice steady. "What's going on here, officer?" The cop smirked, his name tag glinting in the fading light. "Raleigh. This man was caught stealing. We're handling it." Elias frowned. "Stealing what? From where?" Raleigh's smirk faltered, replaced by a glare. "That's none of your business, Captain. I said move along." Elias crossed his arms, his voice firm but calm. "With all due respect, Officer Raleigh, that man doesn't look like a thief. He looks like he's been beaten. Care to explain?" Raleigh stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Back off before I charge you with obstructing justice." Behind him, one of the other officers, a younger man named Cole Harvey, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted between Elias and Raleigh, the tension on his face unmistakable. Private Samara stepped out of the vehicle, her jaw tight. "Sir," his hands. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias followed her gaze. The elderly man, whom Raleigh had called a thief, was shaking uncontrollably. A dark stain spread across the fabric of his sleeves, pooling near his wrists. Elias's stomach tightened. The man wasn't just tied up. He was injured. "Enough," Elias said, his voice like steel. "Untie him." Raleigh let out a sharp laugh. "You're not in charge here, soldier. Get back in your truck and leave, or I'll have you arrested." Elias held his ground, his gaze locking with Raleigh's. "Not until you release him." Raleigh's expression darkened, his hand gripping his holstered weapon. "You're making a mistake." Behind him, Cole looked away, visibly uneasy. Samara's fists clenched at her sides, her voice shaking with frustration. "This isn't justice. This is a disgrace." Elias took a step closer, his voice low and resolute. "We're not going anywhere." The air grew heavy, the tension crackling like a live wire. Raleigh's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his weapon. Behind him, the bound man let out a pained whimper. The sound was faint, but it pierced through the silence, fueling Elias's resolve. This wasn't just a matter of protocol or authority. It was about right and wrong. And Elias Kane had never been one to walk away from injustice. Raleigh's lips curled into a snarl. "Suit yourself, Captain, but you'll regret it." The tension in the air was palpable as Captain Elias Kane squared off against Officer Brent Raleigh. The elderly civilian, Mr. Isaacs, sat trembling in the dirt, his wrists raw and bloody from the tight restraints. Behind Raleigh, his 2 fellow officers shifted uncomfortably, their unease written plainly on their faces. Elias's voice cut through the silence, calm yet commanding. "Untie him. Now." Raleigh's sneer deepened as he stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster at his side. "You don't get it, do you? This is my jurisdiction. You don't make the rules here." Private Samara Davis moved to Elias's side, her eyes locked on the elderly man. "Sir, we can't let this go. He's hurt. Look at him," she said in a low voice, anger simmering beneath her words. Elias didn't flinch. His focus remained on Raleigh. "What's your evidence, officer? What's this man supposed to have stolen?" Raleigh barked a humorless laugh. "Evidence? He's a liar and a thief. That's all the evidence I need." Behind him, Officer Cole Harvey's shoulders tensed. His eyes darted to the bound man, and back to Elias, guilt flickering in his expression. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but quickly shut it when Raleigh shot him a glare. "I'm only going to say this once," Raleigh said, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Get back in your truck and leave, or you'll be spending the night in a cell." Elias took a measured step forward. His team remained still, watching him with unshakable trust. "You may have a badge," Elias said, his tone unyielding, "but I've met men like you before, and they always fall." Raleigh's face darkened. Without warning, he drew his firearm, leveling it at Elias. "You're playing a dangerous game, soldier," he growled. "One step closer, and I won't hesitate." Samara gasped, her fists clenched. The soldiers were unarmed, their weapons locked away in the convoy. They were trained for combat, but Elias knew this wasn't the time for violence. Words were his only weapon now. "Think carefully, officer," Elias said, his voice steady despite the gun aimed at his chest. "Do you really want to take this step? Do you want this to be the legacy you leave behind?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a small, hesitant voice broke the silence. "He's lying," Mr. Isaacs croaked, his voice hoarse. The elderly man raised his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "They stopped me on the road and said I fit the description of a thief. They took everything I had, money I'd been saving for my family. They said it was evidence." Raleigh's jaw clenched as Elias turned to him, realization dawning. "This isn't about justice," Elias said softly. "You're not here to protect anyone. You're here to prey on the weak." Officer Harvey's face paled. Samara saw his fingers twitch nervously by his side and seized the opportunity. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice firm but laced with a hint of compassion. "You know this is wrong. You can stop it, right now." Harvey's lips parted, but Raleigh snapped, "Shut up, Cole. You're either with me or against me." Raleigh's hand trembled slightly as paranoia set in. He reached for his radio and barked into it. "Back up, now. I've got a situation here. Send everyone you've got." Elias turned to Samara. Her face was tight with worry as she whispered, "Sir, if more of them come, we'll be outnumbered." Elias's jaw tightened as his mind raced. He knew one thing for certain. They couldn't wait for help. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "Stay sharp," he murmured. "This isn't over." The sound of distant sirens began to grow louder, echoing in the still air like an ominous promise. The standoff was about to reach its boiling point. The distant wail of approaching sirens added a sense of urgency, but Elias wasn't ready to give up. His team had trained for high-pressure situations, and now their skills were all that stood between life and tragedy. Elias glanced at Private Samara Davis and gave her a subtle nod. She understood immediately. It was time to act. "Raleigh," Elias said, keeping his voice steady and drawing the officer's attention. "You keep talking about justice, but you've got none of it in you. You're just a bully with a badge, preying on those who can't fight back." Raleigh's face twisted in rage. "You don't know anything about me, Captain. Don't you dare stand there and judge me." Elias smirked, baiting him. "I know your type. Small-minded men who think power comes from a gun and a uniform. But we both know the truth, don't we? Deep down, you're scared." Raleigh took the bait, stepping closer to Elias, his gun trained on him. The move left Samara with an opening. She slipped behind the squad car where Mr. Isaacs lay bound, her movements quick and silent. "Shut your mouth," Raleigh barked, his voice shaking. His erratic behavior was unnerving even his own men. Officer Cole Harvey's face was pale, his hand trembling on the grip of his weapon. Meanwhile, Samara crouched beside Mr. Isaacs, her knife glinting in the dim light as she began cutting the ropes binding his wrists. "Stay quiet," she whispered to the terrified man. "You'll be free soon." Elias kept Raleigh distracted, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I've seen men like you fall before, Raleigh. It's always the same. Arrogance blinds them, and justice catches up." "You're wrong," Raleigh spat. "I'm the one in control here." Suddenly, a metallic click shattered the tension. Samara froze as she felt the cold barrel of a gun pressed to the back of her head. She looked up to see Cole Harvey standing over her, his face a mask of conflicted regret. "Cole," she whispered, disbelief in her voice. "It's too late for me," Cole said, his voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "I've done too much. I've gone too far. But it's not too late for you to walk away." Elias's eyes flicked to the scene unfolding behind him. He had hoped Cole's hesitation earlier meant he could be swayed. But now it was clear. The man had chosen his path. "You don't have to do this, Cole," Samara pleaded, her voice trembling. "You still have a choice. It's never too late to do what's right." Raleigh, sensing the shift in power, whirled around and caught sight of the scene. His rage bubbled over. "Harvey, what are you doing? Handle it, or I'll handle you." The chaos emboldened Mr. Isaacs, who weakly tugged at the loosened bindings around his wrists. Samara saw her chance. "Please, Cole, don't let him control you anymore." For a moment, Cole's grip faltered, his eyes darting between Samara and Raleigh. But Raleigh's scream shattered his resolve. "Do it, Harvey, or I swear." A loud metallic clang interrupted him as Elias kicked a loose piece of equipment, distracting Raleigh. The officer spun back to Elias, fury blazing in his eyes. "That's it. You're done," he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before he could act, the piercing sound of tires screeching echoed through the air. All heads turned toward the road as a vehicle roared onto the scene, skidding to a halt in a cloud of dust. The sirens cut abruptly. The doors of the vehicle swung open. But it wasn't police backup. It was a military jeep, and the soldiers stepping out were armed and ready. Raleigh froze, his arrogance cracking under the sudden shift in power. Cole's face crumpled, the weight of his choices crashing down on him. "Raleigh," Elias said, his voice steady but commanding. "It's over." The battlefield was set for a final confrontation. But the fight wasn't over yet. A military jeep roared into view, its unmarked exterior lending an air of quiet authority. It skidded to a halt, kicking up a cloud of dust, and the doors swung open with precision. Colonel Marquez stepped out, his presence commanding and undeniable. A team of armed soldiers flanked him, their rifles slung but ready. His sharp eyes surveyed the scene. The tied-up civilian, the disheveled officers, and his own unarmed soldiers standing firm against the chaos. Without hesitation, he strode toward Elias. "Captain Kane," Marcus said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Situation report." Elias didn't flinch. "Civilian detained without cause, Ter. Injuries inflicted by these officers. They're armed and resisting accountability. Officer Raleigh is leading them." Marquez's gaze shifted to Raleigh, who bristled under the scrutiny. "And you are?" Marcus asked coldly. "Officer Brent Raleigh," he said, his voice laced with defiance. "And this has nothing to do with you. These soldiers are interfering with law enforcement." Marquez arched a brow. "Law enforcement? That man is tied up and bleeding. That doesn't look like law enforcement to me." Raleigh's face twisted in anger. "This is my jurisdiction. These soldiers have no right." Marquez raised a hand, silencing him. Enough. Disarm yourselves and surrender. Now. Raleigh's composure cracked. He took a step back, shaking his head. You don't understand. They're lying. This man is a criminal. These soldiers are covering for him. Before Marquez could respond, Samara stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. Sir, I witnessed everything. Raleigh stopped Mr. Isaacs under false pretenses, stole his money, and injured him. When we intervened, he threatened all of us. He's lying. Raleigh's face flushed red, and he swung his weapon toward Samara. You shut your mouth. He snarled. I'm not going down for this. Marquez's men raised their rifles in unison, but Elias moved faster. In a blur of motion, he stepped toward Raleigh, his movements precise and deliberate. With a quick disarming maneuver, Elias twisted the gun from Raleigh's hands and knocked him to the ground. Raleigh let out a pained grunt as Elias secured the weapon and tossed it aside. It's over, Raleigh, Elias said, his tone resolute. Raleigh groaned, his bluster gone as he lay sprawled on the dirt. The other officers froze, their weapons dropping to the ground. The power dynamic had shifted completely, leaving Raleigh with no more cards to play. As Marquez's soldiers restrained Raleigh, Cole Harvey slumped against the squad car, his face pale. He looked at Elias, his voice barely above a whisper. He made me do it, Cole said, his words tumbling out in a rush. I didn't want to. At first. But he knew things about me. He threatened me. And then it was too late. I thought, if I didn't do what he said, I'd lose everything. Elias fixed him with a hard stare. You had a choice, Cole. You always had a choice. Tears welled in Cole's eyes. You don't understand. He's been doing this for months. Stopping people, taking their money, beating them if they didn't comply. He said no one would believe them. And no one did. Marquez stepped closer. And how many lives did you help him destroy? His voice was cold, cutting through Cole's excuses like a knife. Samara's voice trembled with emotion as she added, how many people begged for mercy, and you looked the other way? How many suffered because you didn't stop him? Cole buried his face in his hands, the weight of his guilt crushing him. Too many, he whispered. I'm sorry. Marquez nodded to his men. Take him too. He'll answer for his role. As the soldiers secured the scene, Elias turned to Mr. Isaacs, helping him to his feet. The elderly man clutched Elias's arm, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, he said, his voice cracking. I thought no one would ever help me. Elias placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You're safe now. We won't let anyone hurt you again. The truth had come to light, but the cost of Raleigh's corruption was etched in everyone's faces. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would not fade easily. Officer Brent Raleigh and his accomplices stood in handcuffs, their authority stripped away, their protests falling on deaf ears. Colonel Marquez oversaw the arrests with a stern expression, his men moving efficiently to secure the scene. Elias Kane stood nearby, his unwavering gaze fixed on Raleigh. Days later, a military tribunal convened to address the officers' crimes. Evidence of corruption, theft, and abuse of power was presented in damning detail. Raleigh sat stone-faced, his confidence eroding with every testimony. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison without the possibility of parole, his crimes too egregious to ignore. Cole Harvey and the third officer received lighter sentences for their lesser roles and cooperation during the investigation. Both were stripped of their badges and sentenced to 3 years in prison, a decision meant to serve as a stern warning to others. Before being taken into custody, Cole approached Elias, his face pale with remorse. I deserve whatever's coming, he said, his voice trembling. But I need to know, is there any way to make it right? Elias studied him for a long moment before replying. Justice will decide your fate. What you choose to do with the rest of your life, that's on you. Redemption isn't given, Cole. It's earned. Cole nodded, tears in his eyes, and turned away. His path forward would be long and uncertain, but Elias's words lingered in his mind like a beacon. Raleigh's downfall made national headlines. His name became synonymous with corruption, a chilling example of how unchecked power could destroy lives. Public outrage surged, sparking calls for reform in local law enforcement. "This isn't over," Raleigh bellowed, struggling against his restraints. "You think you can take me down? You're all dead wrong." Marquez turned to him, his tone icy. "No, Raleigh, you are." With the officers detained, the truth began to unravel swiftly. A hidden stash of confiscated money and stolen items was found in Raleigh's squad car. Testimonies from victims poured in as word of the arrest spread. It was undeniable. Raleigh's reign of terror had finally come to an end. In prison, Raleigh was no longer the man with the badge and the gun. Stripped of his power and isolated from his allies, he became a target. News of his crimes spread quickly among the inmates, and Raleigh soon found himself on the receiving end of the same fear and oppression he once inflicted on others. The walls of his cell, once a symbol of his dominance, became his cage, a fitting end for a man who had thrived on the suffering of others. Thank you for spending your time with us. Your support means the world. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and share your views. We love hearing from our amazing community around the globe. Together, let's share stories that inspire, heal, and connect us all. Hit subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next tale.